Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. Like Stories of Old is a YouTube channel that does movie commentaries. Movies have become the dominant mode of religious propagation in our culture. Storytelling, not just movies in theaters, movies on TV, television shows, Netflix. Some of you who are over 70 might not be aware of this, but people consume a lot of movies and stories. Of course, some of it in book form, but a lot of it on screens, either silver screens in the front of the movie theater before COVID, or now on screens at home. Now, we want to mentally realize how movies are programming us religiously, and these channels actually help make us aware. What these channels usually do is take little clips and stills from the movies and basically explain how the symbolism and the movie makers are using their craft to communicate with us. Now, this channel, like Stories of Old, uses movie making strategies in order to keep our interest in their commentary on the movies. The genre is pretty simple. The movies are crafted, beautiful religious propaganda, and the stars, which guide us, begin to feel like heroes or familiar friends. And notice how easy it is to be a star in Hollywood and then become a governor of the state of California, no less. Now, heroic representations are pretty much a staple of the movies. We love, we idolize, we worship and adore these beings of light because we project ourselves onto them and we find idealized, heroic, dramatic representations of ourselves doing things that we never would or could do ourselves. And so what we sort of become are faithful members of the Church of Cinema. Now, there are two videos in this video series by this one YouTube maker. The first is entitled The Fundamental Difference Between Stories and Reality. And the second, Your Life is Not a Hero's Journey. There's a third one coming, which I haven't seen yet because it isn't out yet, but I will see it. And I'm sort of trying to anticipate where he's going to go with this. The first question basically we should ask the narrator, how do you, the narrator and curator of the images of our gods, know what reality really is? Because he says, well, there's story and then there's reality, and you should know the difference between them. Well, we're going to have to find out what he means by story, and he never really sort of tells us what he means by reality. He thinks we should know this, and so we should ask him for his credentials. What makes you an expert on reality? Now, where he goes is the hero's journey. The fundamental difference between story and reality is this. Most successful stories or fandoms, big franchises like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of these are built on Joseph Campbell, what he called the hero's journey, the monomyth. Some of you might remember this because I used this to contrast the story of the book of Jonah and how that story is told. Now, Campbell studied mythology and stories and patterns and noted similarities throughout these patterns, and more often than not, the exceptions prove the rule. Now, what he tended to find was that in many ways, the story of Jesus seemed to come up again and again and again. This is sort of his title of his great book was Hero of a Thousand Faces, and in many ways we find Jesus with 1,000 faces. Campbell's book demonstrates why Christianity became so successful, because the Christian story was able to integrate so many themes and so many archetypes within its message. Jesus was the archetypal hero, and the pattern was so clear and so pure in Jesus' story. So pure, in fact, that in almost any high school literature class, you'll be taught about the Christ figure. And you can find Christ figures in Luke Skywalker. In the Lord of the Rings, they're really split amongst three characters: prophet, priest, and king. Gandalf is prophet, Aragorn is king, and Frodo, in some ways, is the sacrificial lamb that will take the ring of doom to, or the ring of power to the cracks of Mordor. Neo in the Matrix is very much a Christ figure. Harry Potter is very much a Christ figure. Iron Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, brings back the world at the cost of his life at the end of their narrative arc. It's quite clear in older stories, Tale of Two Cities, Les Miserables, the powerful leading men gave their lives sacrificially for those who had no power to save themselves from the too powerful evil that threatened their world, their hope, their happiness, and their future, and their sacrifice won the victory. Now the question is, are these stories reality? And like stories of old basically says no. These are not stories of reality. His question assumes we share a common assumption about the knowledge of reality. The maker of these videos lives in the Netherlands and is a modern European. What's never stated seems to be his assumption that reality is a series of meaningless, purposeless, chaotic events that make up our lives. And this is in contrast with the hero's journey. Because what does it take to really tell a story? What it takes is hindsight. Stories are told in reverse. Stories are always told with hindsight. Because what we do is we select episodes and images of the story, all of them that feed into the final conclusion, the point of the story that we find to be the point of the story. Notice the words. We select elements from the random stream to narratively construct a story which someone, ourselves, the makers of the story, create then the purpose for the story and achieves its goal. The story itself has no purpose until we bring it one. And this is underlying his assumption of what reality is, and therefore your life is not a story, it's just a series of random events. The story is what someone might tell at your funeral to give it poignancy and meaning, but that poignancy and meaning and purpose are only brought to the story by the storyteller and is not actually found inherent in the story. The telling creates the story. Now, if you're not a story, then you're certainly not a hero. As the Greeks noticed, heroes were exceptional people. They were often demigods. They were the sons of Zeus and the children of beautiful women that the gods decided to seduce and have their way with. Read the myths of Thor or Hercules. What happens, however, in Christianity is that the gods get democratized. Christianity subtly suggests to people that they are stories and they are in fact critical figures in their stories. People conquered markets and careers, not just enemies and lands. Stories influenced individuals to make their mundane stories heroic stories, nobly standing by a suffering child or a suffering spouse or an insufferable job for the sake of the family rather than ditching it, which was everybody's temptation. Well, this is rewarding, and this, in fact, is heroic. And what you find is basically what he says is, well, people regularly now imagine their lives to be stories and themselves the heroes of their stories. This leads us into the more contemporary question of diversity and representation, because so many of the people in these movies are straight white men. Can't women be heroes? And so what you find is Hollywood puts women in the role of usually violent men winning victory at the expense violently of their enemies. But in some ways, the move begs the question, because most Hollywood stories are simply masculine violence. Is there no room for a feminine hero? In ancient Israel, weren't the mothers of Israel who bore many children, weren't they the heroes of the nation? That endured all the way to the heroes of Mother Russia. Just as the evil story of violent colonialism gets inclusive, its deconstruction gets a little cynical. Now, We're waiting for part 3, but I have some guesses what it will say. It will say, well, there really is no meaning in your life found in reality. You can't know the story because you can't create a story. You can't create a story because you don't know the end of your story. You can imagine that you are a story. You can imagine that the hero, and the experience of this imagination is the best that you can do. You can get the feels for the moment, but in the end, well, just try to be fair and just help one another. And if this helps you feel a little heroic, well, good for you. But must we buy the assumptions of his storytelling? Because after all, he's telling a story too. Is it true that we don't know the end of the story? He actually smuggles his known end of the story in. Because, well, there is an end to the story. You will die. You will be forgotten. The universe will die. Everything will be forgotten. So retreat into an imaginary storyverse, like the movie theater, for as long as you can, until death surprisingly and suddenly takes you, usually unaware, kicking and screaming because you thought you'd have more time. If you've been following along in the book of 1 Peter, you might be aware that Peter has already addressed this question. Therefore, ridding yourselves of malice and deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander, like newborn infants, long for the unadulterated spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up into salvation. Well, what is this salvation? Salvation from what? Well, salvation from everything. If you have tasted that the Lord is kind, to whom you have been drawing near, a living stone, rejected by men, but chosen and precious in the sight of God. What Peter basically says is, you have seen the end of your story and can now tell the story on the basis of the ending that you have seen. Well, what is the ending? The ending is the living stone, the crucifixion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And that's your story too. Now, particularized by all of the elements of you, but you are a story, and you follow a hero into his story. And what Christianity actually does, and Peter does this, is, oops, got a typo here. Peter and Christianity have radically democratized heroism and living stories. Like stories of old has a point. The Greek hero was a demigod, exceptional in birth and ability. But in 1 Peter 2, he is the living stone. You are living stones. The pattern of your life follows his life. And at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, he goes and tells us some things that we don't like to be told. And he says, even if you're a slave, pattern your story after the living stone. If you're the wife of a miserable, unchristian husband, pattern your life after the living stone. And if you're a husband, same to you. Paul will say in Ephesians 5, lay down your life for your wife. This is the pattern of the living stones. And it doesn't matter at what station you are, the pattern holds true. The pattern isn't enacted by the sword, but by submission to Christ. If you live like Christ, you will die like Christ, and you will be raised like Christ. So in chapter 3, he begins to, well, draw it all together. And finally, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, showing mutual affection, compassionate, humble, not repaying evil for evil, or insult for insult. That's usually what the Hollywood heroes do. But on the other hand, blessing others. Because for this reason you were called. In other words, calling creates story. So that you could inherit a blessing. There's the end. He's showing you the end. And now he quotes a very ancient psalm, even old for him. For the one who wants to love life and see good days must keep his tongue from evil, and his lips must not speak deceit. He must turn away from all evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. Sounds like a hero. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Sounds like a normal good and bad evil, but it's usually just the second part that Hollywood picks up on. The first part haunts us because we wonder, can this really work? Can it really happen? Isn't it true that when you turn the other cheek, you just get hit again? You conquer not with swords shedding the blood of your adversaries, because we don't battle against flesh and blood. You conquer in the way that Jesus conquered, even if it costs you your life in this age. And who is the one who will harm you if you are a zealous adherent for what is good? Now, Peter is twisting on that word there because zeal was taken to be a very bloody word, and the Apostle Paul knew it. But even if you might suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their intimidation or be disturbed, but set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts. Let he be your hero, and let he be your model. Always ready to make a defense to anyone who asks for an accounting concerning the hope that is in you. Because when people watch you, they will say, wait a minute, by doing this, aren't you just losing your life? Well, my life, if you go back to chapter 1, well, it's hidden. I have an inheritance. It's preserved. It's ready for me. And so therefore, this is the way I conquer. And verse 16 makes that clear. But do so with courtesy and respect, having a good conscience, so that in the things in which you are slandered, the one who maligns your good conduct in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if God wills it, than for doing evil. You will suffer. The revelation of Jesus' resurrection affords a far larger platform upon which the story is presented. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust. Here's the Jesus pattern. In order that he could bring to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which also he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, who were formerly disobedient when the patience of God waited in the days of Moses, while an ark was being constructed, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were rescued through water. And also corresponding to this, baptism now saves you. You can see this is getting very mythological. And there's a great deal of conversation about this passage, which I'm not going to go into because I want you to get the point and not be distracted by the scholarly commentary on the point, because the point is clear. And also corresponding to this, baptism now saves you. What do you mean by that? What is the baptism? Well, it's the baptism Christ underwent, and it's baptisms or ordeals, their tests, their trials. It's the baptism that you, because he underwent, you also will undergo a form of it, because he is the hero, he is the model, and your heroism follows his. And also corresponding to this, baptism now saves you not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, has gone into heaven with angels and authorities and powers, having been subjected to him. In Christ, all stories come together. There's a reason the monomyth seems to focus on Jesus. He takes dominance over every narrative. Some of the most interesting verses in the book are here, and there's plenty of reading to do about it, but the point is there. He has dominion. The best story wins. Now, we'll have to wait until section 3 of the video series, but like stories of old, well, all of the stories of old are like this. Like stories of old seems to imply there are no real stories. So you can pick your own. Ironically, you can imagine you pick the Jesus story. But this door can't end in this frame. Because here's the thing. Why would you pick the Jesus story if there were no resurrection? Because the Jesus story links to it. The resurrection is the final validation and affirmation of the story. And for some of you, that's a struggle. Like stories of old doesn't promise you anything but a series of mundane episodes unless you are exceptional. But even then, you die. Now, C.S. Lewis knew myths, and he looked at them well, and he declared that it seemed that the key to all the old myths, the hero with 1,000 faces, drops into history in real flesh, and the pattern of his life fulfills all the myths. That, on one hand, tragedies are true. Good heroes suffer and die at the hands of evil men. At the same time, God gets his way in the end. Jesus is the myth made flesh. He fits into the story that all stories had been pointing towards. Living stones can find any place, even the lowest place. For Peter, slaves and women follow their hero. The living stones from bondage through transformation into glory, no matter the time or the place. And this, I would assert, has led to us believing we are stories, us believing we know our end, us believing that though we lose and though we suffer, we will win. Why? Because we see the living stone. So the question you have to ask yourself is, which stories are forming in you? Now, you could do worse in looking at these stories. You could do worse in being tempted to imagine that you are a story. You could do worse to imagine that there in fact is a hero out there who will suffer for those who don't have the strength to overcome themselves. But you should ask, which stories are you immersed in? You know what the silver screen heroes are like. They step out of the screen and they become governors of the state of California, but they grow old and the skin is less taut and the grave will take them. Would they die for you? What will it take to believe the living stone? What will it take to see the future you in the living stone? What are the steps you must repeat in order to make it more real to you than just a story in a movie?